would like you to acknowledge Francisco Ortiz-Delgado from the Autonomous Metropolitan University of Coahuilmalpa. And he's going to be speaking to us about Mexican philosophy of history and Messianism in a non-authoritarian regime, the case of López Obrador. So, Francisco, it's all yours.
Thank you, Andre. Let me know when I am about to run out of time. Maybe I could talk
Okay.
so much. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Well, the president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has an idea of history that follows a particular speculative philosophy of history. And one that I propose is interprets certain events of the past as important for the benefit of human beings, and one that assigns an intrinsic and a priori moral quality to those important human events, and that assigns to history a transcendental telos, namely the attainment of the benefit of or good of the people. More precisely, I call philosophy of the transhistoric history to the speculative philosophy of history that López follows. First, historic history, I understand this as the set of historical facts that are interpreted as the most important and most transforming from the general human past or from a particular period of the human past. And second, historic history is events interpreted as a totality that has an inherent a priori specific ontological sense and logic, where both the sense and the logic encompass more than the past, as both are projected to the present and to the future. The telos of López is the best of the people, where good is understood as the improvement of economic, social, political, and cultural conditions, and where people refers primarily to the majority of the population of Mexico. And where it is taught, following the thinker Alfonso Reyes, a thinker from the first half of the 20th century, that the people are the source of the Constitution and the laws in a democracy, as well as the promoter and sole legitimate architect of all the modifications and reforms of the laws. López Obrador considers that the history of Mexico, whose starting point has been traditionally September 16, 1810, this history of Mexico has been characterized by three great transformations, all of them, of course, beneficial to the people. The first of the so-called transformation is the Mexican Independence War, started in 1810 and ended in 1821. The second is the Reform War. And the third is, of course, the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910 and ended in 1917. This periodization of important events in Mexico is a fundamental part of the particular philosophy of the transhistoric history that López follows, because they reflect a vision that considers this historical process as evidence that there is a telos in the Mexican history, the benefit of the people. This is the telos. We have an interpretation of three well-known political military processes of Mexican history, in which all three have a priori and inherently moral outcomes. An interpretation where such outcomes are the evidence that proves that the country is marching infallibly towards an increasingly better stage for the people. That is, we have a transhistorical conception of history because its assigned telos goes beyond the human past by projecting itself to the present and to the future. Based on these ideas, López declared that his socio-political movement and his future victory in the election of the 1st of July 2018 would generate a forced transformation, a transformation that, as I interpret, will comply with the telos assigned to history. One of the first explicit mentions of that I found about the teleological idea of the fourth transformation of Mexico was June 2016, when López said, I quote, "We have to push the idea about locating our current movement among the great transformation of Mexico, independence, reformation, revolution. If we are in this struggle, it's because we want to change the regime to substitute this corrupt regime of injustices and privileges. What we want is to establish a true democracy with social dimension, with justice. That is the ultimate objective. And I repeat, we need to know what our ancestors have accomplished in other epochs." End of quote. So in López's vision, the history of Mexico has also periods of socio-economical and moral decline. After the War of Independence, after 1821, the retrograde First Mexican Empire of Agustín de Iturbide and the authoritarian dictatorships of Santa Anna appeared after the liberal Republican restoration of the 19th century, after 1876, the latifundista or landownerist dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz will come, together with the anti-democratic measures supported by the regime's indulged positivistic ideologues. And after the revolution, the kleptocracy of the neoliberal or neo-Porfirian period will appear. This is from 1982 to 2018. Thus, López's vision of history is progressive, but accepts the appearance of multiple setbacks. I therefore suggest that following the proposals of the philosopher of history, Karl López, the president's idea of progress is one that has a metaphysical religious nature insofar as it belongs to the modern idea of progress in general, which is, and I quote López, as Christian by derivation as it is anti-Christian by implication, and is an eschatological anticipation of a future salvation, and consequently a vision of the present state of mankind as one of depravity. And specifically, the political state in Mexico during the so-called neoliberal period from 1982 to 2018 has been described by López as one full of moral depravity. It is understood that for López, a period after a beneficial process occurs, events and individuals harmful to the people can and do appear, and then new benign transformations are needed. The history of Mexico, López, is not an advance without setbacks. It is like that upward spiral described by the famous Italian philosopher of history, Giambattista Vico. The sense of history is circular, but at the same time progressive. Likewise, López's perspective of Mexican and world history is optimistic because he estimates that, in the end, the will and desires of the people will triumph. Then, the study of politic and world history, rather than the study of culture, science, or art, or daily life, to explain the changes of a state is a trend that comes from Greco-Roman antiquity, practiced by historians and philosophers like Polybius, Xenophon, Cicero, and so on. These scholars understood politics as the necessary platform to improve the conditions of the society or the state. And then, congruent with this, López frequently repeats an idea in his speeches: to start the fight against corruption in the country from above in the political position. And this above is nothing but a reference to the most powerful political position. I quote, "We are going to clean up the government from top to bottom like we do sweep the stairs," López said in September 2017. Then it should be observed that for López, each one of the three transformations, the independence, reform, revolution, was beneficial in the same measure. The results of the three had contributed equally to the advancement of the nation, But in addition, the three had been co-starred by the people, or starred by the people. Thus, López's unconditional faith towards the desires and the intrinsic benignity of the people is evident. The people are always right, because in the long run, they always triumph in history. If some members of the people are wrong, those members of the lower classes who supported the conservatives during the reform period in the 19th century, it is because they have been manipulated. López then has an unshakable and pure faith in the people and in their morality. Ergo, he trusts that the people, most of the time, will follow the metaphysical and a prioristic sense of history. This interpretation of history is theological metaphysical, as the leading idea of a temporal progression toward a final goal in the future implies a theological interpretation of history as a history of fulfillment and salvation. The people need leaders to update and promote the achievements of the goals of the transhistoric history. Therefore, the president claims that past figures such as Miguel Hidalgo here in the picture, or Benito Juárez and Francisco y Madero as the main leaders who have helped the Mexican people to actualize, materialize their own wishes. That is, the wishes of the transhistoric history. Such three past figures were, in different determined moments, the instruments of the people, or the instruments of the transhistoric history. Hidalgo here is considered the designer of the benign objectives of the first transformation, the Revolution of Independence. Juarez here is considered the designer of the benign objectives of the Reformation, and for López, he's maybe the supreme hero of Mexican history. And Madero is the designer of the democratic objectives of the revolution. But López also finds in Mexico's past some leaders who were characterized by their anti-democratic measures and primarily by their actions against the interests of the people. Those politicians who were enemies of the people have been Antonio López de Santa Anna during most of the first half of the 19th century. As you can see, he was president in several occasions in the 19th century. And the other villain is Porfirio Díaz from 1884 to 1911, and Carlos Salinas de Gortari. This was president from 1988 to 1994. The former President Salinas, here with the President of the United States, ex-President George Bush's father, is particularly and harshly criticized by López, considering Salinas almost as his nemesis or as a diabolical figure. In Mexico, I quote López, inequality ascended during the Salinas administration when the transfer of public goods to particulars associated with this president was more intense and blatant. With Salinas, the imbalance between rich and poor deepened as never before. Salinas is the father of modern inequality. It is clear then that privatization is not the panacea. End of quote. Then it is evident that Santa Anna, Diaz, and Salinas have been the three main instigating leaders, villains in the destruction of the Mexican transhistoric historical telos. In fact, they contributed to the evil or damage of the people. We have here an argument that complements López's meta-narrative of history, one that also is essentially modernist. Such meta-narrative or modernist interpretation of history is, using Jeffrey Barash's words, I quote, rooted in the original Christian experience of time through its tacit assimilation of the idea of an orientation in the lines of continuity between different historical epochs. This assimilation becomes manifest through the profound affinity in the interpretation of historical time as development toward a goal that persists among all the changes. End of quote. In López's meta-narration, it is clear who are the benefactors and who the opposers of the advancements of history's metaphysical telos or sense. According to López, one of the most outstanding obstacles to Mexican history's goal were the 19th century conservatives and the conservatives in general. That is, the members of the faction who, due to their refusal to accept the reform laws, would provoke the War of the 3 Years and the Second French Intervention during the second half of the 19th century. Once the liberals in 1867 defeated the conservatives and the interventionists, the country experienced a period of pacification. There were pardons and appeasement that allowed Mexico to continue its advance. Analogously, López assured that he would not carry out political persecution, that he will implement his forced transformation peacefully. I quote López, "Our main legacy will be to purify the public life of Mexico, and we are moving forward. We have not undertaken factious persecutions or political revenge," end of quote. Politics and democracy are the new means to achieve a forced transformation in Mexico. Morality is then essential for the proper development of a nation, according to López. The pursuit of correct morals by the government and leaders is what directs to the progress of the country. But what moral is correct for the president? It is possible to describe his morality. He professes an amalgamation of an enlightened liberal moral, a Christian moral, and a humanistic moral. It can be sustained that he follows a moral that comes from the Enlightenment. If we pay attention to his multiple references to human progress as a good, with capital G, as a moral act, and where progress, in the words of, again, Karl López, I quote, had to assume the function of providence, that is, to foresee and to provide for the best future, end of quote. It can be sustained that he has a liberal moral if we consider that he estimates the fight of the progress as a moral act or action. We understand that he follows the Christian moral because he constantly talks of justice, charity, love, Christian virtues as objectives and means to achieve a better country. And from the multiple references to equality and dignity as goods for all humans, we have in the president the possession of a humanistic moral that appreciates the struggle for equality and or dignity as a morally correct action. Then, if we estimate that for López, history is teleological, that is, it has a transcendental moralistic telos, therefore, it's possible to ascertain that such politician possesses quasi-messianic qualities for this reason. As López is himself the author of a discernment of what is correct and incorrect in the Mexican past, thus he is the author of a quasi-messianic discernment ultimately achieved through the study of history of what will be correct and incorrect for the present and the future of Mexico. Thus, López fulfills the objectives of a social scientist who, through the study of a society, pursues its prognosis. But he also fulfills the objectives of a prophet to whom is revealed how to build a better future. Nevertheless, the predictive activities of López are not achieved by divine illumination as in a real religious prophet, but by a rational reflection based on various historical research and personal experience. This is the main reason for which I identify a quasi-messianic characteristic inside the ideology and policies of López, and not a proper and complete messianism. Another quasi-religious characteristic of López's politics is found in his non-acceptance of other truths or interpretation of the future and or the good for Mexico. He does not accept versions of the past present that opposes his modernist liberal interpretation of history. That is, as in some religions, he seems not accepting other definition descriptions of happiness, salvation, and or illumination. Furthermore, he only accepts one way to achieve the telos of the Mexican history, a moralizing anti-corruption policy that is also liberal and loving, peaceful, reconciling in nature. For example, the president has declared unacceptable a strategy of a strong direct fight against the organized crime. The circumstances that for López there is only one way for the benefit of the Mexican people is one more reason to consider him a quasi-Messiah. And there is no way to consider him a Messiah in a pure political religious terms. As far as I know, there is no political and or social group in Mexico that seriously considers López as a savior or Messiah, not even among his most fervent supporters in his political party, Morena. In short, I propose that the president has a quasi-Messianic ideology because for complex reasons. First, his particular interpretation of history, which allowed him to the establishment of what is moral and what is immoral for the people, and therefore allowed him, three, to acquire the knowledge of what supposedly is the best or most beneficial future for Mexico, all of which led him to develop four, certain intolerance for the political methods and for his advocates that oppose his anti-corruption, liberal, loving, reconciliatory way to achieve the telos of the transhistoric history. With what has been said so far, it is possible to criticize the shallow, simplistic, and biased analysis of some commentators, such as, among others, Enrique Krause, who affirmed that López was called Messiah. This in a famous article from 2006, long before López became president of Mexico. And there is some reasons that Enrique Krause said for his assertion of López as a tropical Messiah. A, implementing populist measures such as the institutionalization of financial aid to older adults or the rapid creation of multiple high schools in Mexico City when López was the mayor of the Mexico City. B, resorting to social polarization. C, proposing more humane and egalitarian politics. D, proposing a Republican austerity. E, declaring that the law that is not just is not useful. F, being photographed with a book about the life of Thomas Aquinas, and for this supposedly having anti-democratic attitudes and ideas against the division of powers. But what does all of the law have to do directly with Messianism? Practically nothing. Although some of the points mentioned by Krause may be considered reprehensible for a politician who considers himself a Democrat, none are directly and explicitly linked by Krause with any specific teleology, and as we know, without a teleology, there can be no Messianism at all. Thus, Krause's comparison of López with a Messiah is unfounded, unsupported, and devoid of all academic credit and full of mere controversial political purposes. We could refute all the points made by Krause, but it is better just to underline that López quasi-messianism cannot come or does not come from anywhere but his political, theological, teleological use of the past. Just as Christianity's theological, teleological interpretation of history will have caused a messianism to emerge within itself, so López's interpretation of history forces his politics that are molded and strengthened by such interpretation to have quasi-messianic qualities. And the conclusions. A, López's interpretation of history is metaphysical, theological, and teleological. He gives history consciously or unconsciously a telos that is resolved beyond reality in the ethical metaphysical field. B, metaphysics theology is a knowledge that goes beyond historical physical reality. a transhistorical knowledge. C. López's interpretation of history goes beyond historical physical reality, is transhistorical. First, López is a ruler who uses a transhistorical metaphysical knowledge to know which strategy will be better for the future of a country, Mexico. Two, the transhistorical metaphysical knowledge that allows to know which policy will be best for the future of a country is a knowledge proper of a Messiah. Three, López is a ruler who uses a knowledge proper of a Messiah. Thus, we have that the quasi-Messiah features of the President of Mexico come exclusively from his metaphysical and quasi-theological interpretation of history. That is to say, his quasi-Messianism comes from the fact that he considers history as a transcendental historic history, a prioristically and inherently possessing a final teleological meaning that consists in the achievement of the benefit, progress, improvement of the people. For him, history in its entirety is transhistorical and possesses an intrinsic telos that goes beyond the past and is projected into the future or the present. López estimates that the people will reach such telos in this present or in a certain point of the near future or the future. A telos that we could say is transcendently and quasi-messianically analogous, if not equivalent, to the speculative philosophies of history, secular philosophies of history, like the one developed by Karl Marx. According to Karl López, I quote, "A kingdom of God without God and on earth is the ultimate goal or telos, an ideal of Marx's historical messianism." End of quote. Furthermore, López's interpretation of history is intrinsically moral insofar as he assigns to its transcendental sense an always morally correct way that benefits the people. López's quasi-messianism does not come from any religious group, nor from the conferring to his person by some political or social or religious group of the qualities of a unique savior or prophet. Mexico currently is not, like before, a country with a one-man rule, and nobody truly considers López's political views as infallible religious dictates. Mexico is not a country that for the most part idolizes or considers him perfect. In fact, the political opposition has developed a broad, continuous, and persistent criticism and propaganda against him. The quasi-messianic character of his ideology and policies does not come from his pro-Christian comments, nor from his occasional comparisons with Jesus or his occasional praise Jesus as being a character who helped the people, who was humanist and altruistic. Therefore, we need a complex and extraordinarily strong theoretical frame in order to argue that certain politician follows or professes a messianism or a quasi-messianism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel, for